Hi guys, Bill again. Something I've got very strong opinions on is history. We can't change the past, but we can certainly learn from it. Human nature hasn't changed. I think that understanding the events of the past is vital if we're going to avoid making the same old mistakes time after time. But one of the biggest obstacles we've got to learning our history is this popular cultural narrative that we share. The facts always seem to be presented just so, to justify this nice simple progression from the chaotic barbaric past to the neat civilised present. It's trite and it utterly fails to answer any of the burning questions of the past or the present. You can take Britain for an example. The State School or History Channel version of her history is fairly easy to follow. First the Romans invaded, then the Normans invaded, and they were both stopped by the Scots, and then England and Scotland declared peace, the monarchs were stripped of their power, and the plucky Brits go on to win 3 world wars and conquer India. Gandhi kicks everybody back home, the end. If you're really lucky, they might just mention Jethro Tull or John Smeaton in passing, but it doesn't tell you anything. Well, not unless they actually tell you who Jethro Tull was. There's huge questions left unanswered. Why do the Scots, who apparently fought off much bigger neighbours on numerous occasions, why do they speak English? And why do the Welsh still exist, even although the Picts are long gone? And where did the Romans go? For that matter, where did the Angles and even the Vikings go to? I think it's better to start from the beginning. The Roman Empire collapsed in what would become England in much the same way it collapsed everywhere else, and that's to say that some parts were overrun by barbarians, but some continued quite happily on their way, virtually unchanged. They were all eventually assimilated by the newer kingdoms that followed Rome's fall, but the Romans themselves didn't actually go anywhere. They're still right here. You can take a holiday down in Bath if you really want to. The English, they derived their name from the Angles. Now they're a tribe that originated in the Anglian Peninsula in northern Germany. Bede was an 8th century historian, Bede claimed that they, the Jutes, who were Danish settlers, and the Saxons from Saxony obviously, modern Niedersachsen if you live in Germany. Those people were the ancestors of the modern, to him, 8th century English. Now, that's more likely to be true culturally than in an exact physical sense. You need an awful lot of boats to move an entire nation west over sea. But there were plenty of people already living in this Bretwald. They were once Britons, then they were Romans. Well, with the new settlers, now they're Anglo-Saxons. The Viking raids and eventually the Viking invasions, particularly around York, from the 9th to the 11th century, that mixed things up a little bit, but William the Conqueror's invasion pretty much put a stop to play in 1066. So that leaves you with this huge question. Why isn't Britain one big island called England? Well, no prizes for guessing. It's them stormy jocks and their taff mates. The Romans failed to conquer the Picts. Now that meant that Alapa, the northwest of Britain, had been independent culturally, economically and militarily for a very long time by the time the Gaels turned up in the 4th century. Now their interaction with the Picts would need a lot more than a 10-minute vid, believe me, but Kenneth MacAlpin united them all in the 9th century. The important part isn't how or why he did that. It's the fact that the people of Alapa, and eventually their child, Scotland, they believed themselves to be one united nation 4 centuries before Edward Plantagenet tried to make them all English. Now the Longshanks was onto a loser from the start. You see, the Scots were a lot less fractious than their reputation might suggest, and there were already a large number of Normans who'd arrived and were resident in Scotland. They went native with a passion when Edward tried to establish his authority using brute force. Do you know, legend has it that his general, The Bishop of Durham was flayed and turned into a belt by William Wallace after the invasion. Remember William Wallace? He was that wee blue-faced Australian fella you saw in Braveheart. Now at the end of it all, we still ended up with a Norman king, but at least Robert the Bruce had the decency to grow himself some ginger hair, you know? Question still remains though, if we weren't conquered, why do we speak English? Well, I think the girls will like this one. Well, as long as they're not feminists. Margaret of Wessex was a Hungarian princess. But Margaret of Wessex fled England after the Norman invasion. Now she was stormbound and ended up in Scotland, where she met Malcolm III, Scotland's king, in 1170. Now this Malcolm, Callum Can More, he was a vicious, wary bastard. He spent his whole life raiding the Norse settlements in the north of Scotland and the Northumbrian, the Anglo-Saxon settlements in northern England. He took allies anywhere he could find them. At one point or another he was allied to the Norse, to the French, to the English. It just didn't matter to him. So this man was very quick to see the advantage of marrying this princess that turned up on his doorstep here. See, just by saying I do, he gained her retainers as his retainers. Now that included a corps of trained knights, a small fleet. It even included a dowry, plenty of ready coin for funding his next raids. But don't think that Margaret was some kind of shrinking violet. She was no mug either. Can More was a god of war. The man was 63 years old before somebody finally did the world a favour. Put a sword to his throat. No one in these islands, least of all the Normans had only just arrived, no one could threaten Margaret with that beast by her side. And better than that, Callum had absolutely no interest in ruling a kingdom. Margaret quite literally had a free reign. Oh, and she used it. Inside of a generation, she changed the religion of Scotland from its strong, ancient Celtic Christian tradition to the modern, but at that point much weaker, continental Catholic. Historians like to imagine that she was pious. Now, I don't know, maybe she was, but I think it's much more likely that she had more leverage over these continental priests than she was ever going to have over the indigenous clergy. She declined to learn Gaelic. That was something she wouldn't do. Instead, she compromised and she insisted that English become the language of court. Now that, my friends, was the beginning of the end for Gaelic culture in Scotland. She did much more than that though. She revitalised the infrastructure of Canmore's kingdom. She built roads, she rebuilt fortresses, she encouraged the growth of towns. She even built a ferry route across the Forth, one of the largest river estuaries in Britain. Now again, historians like to think that there was a religious aspect to this, that she was encouraging worshippers to cross the Forth to visit one of her new churches. And that's probably a large part of it, but you can't avoid realising the tremendous advantages of having this vast sea lane running between the northern and southern halves of the Scottish kingdom. And think about it, she could have just built another church instead of two large towns and a fleet of ferry boats. The long and the short of it is that when Edward decided to claim Scotland as part of his kingdom 2 centuries after Margaret, the Scots, well, the rulers anyway, the Scots were already speaking a recognisable form of English. And the Bruce even wrote the Declaration of Arbroath in it, which I'm sure Edward really enjoyed reading. So what about those Picts then? Well again, the people are still here. You know, that their blood flows through our veins same as everybody else's, but the influx of the Scots and the Norse in the northwest of Scotland, and the close relationship between eastern Scotland and the northeast of England, remember those Angles? It completely swamped their culture. We don't even know what language they spoke these days. Now the modern Welsh, just like the Picts, are descended from Britain's indigenous population, but after briefly regaining power after the Romans collapsed, they got gradually pushed back into the mountains and the valleys on Britain's rocky west coast. Now the once mighty kingdom of Strathclyde's a modern name for it, it's known as, apologies to the Welsh, Tyrannis Ystryd Clwyd, or just Alt Clwyd. That fell to the Norse in the 9th century. It was the last of the old northern kingdoms, Yr Hen Ogledd, that were controlled by the Britons. I mean, Brynich fell to the Angles in the 6th century, and Rheged lasted perhaps 100 years more. The ever-increasing numbers and the power of the Anglo-Saxons pushed those Britons, the modern Welsh, into the west. Again though, don't get the idea that this was some kind of ethnic cleansing. The local populations probably didn't change dramatically. The real change was a cultural one, in terms of language, in terms of the rulers, and especially in terms of the laws that they lived under. Now that's important because it's something that modern Welsh scholars are very conscious of. They make considerable efforts to keep their language and their culture alive and distinct from the remainder of our English-speaking island. Could learn a lot from the Welsh. Okay, anyone's head starting to hurt yet? The point that I'm making is that history is messy and it's chaotic, but the answers are there. We can learn a huge amount from it, but we need to know what happened. And more than that, we need to understand why it happened, if we're going to be able to draw the right conclusions, if we're going to be able to take anything out of it. Otherwise, we might as well just watch Hollywood movies. It seems a pity that we don't seem to be prepared to go that extra mile and try and understand what it is we're hearing about. Anyway, I've waffled on quite enough for one day, I think. Laters, guys.